Hi, everybody. It's Thursday, September 5th, 2024, and I'm just in the middle of my 10,000 steps for today. This is my update of my video journal, to recover from the trauma of watching my little brother with Down syndrome be locked up by the BC New Democratic Party government for 588 days and then die. I believe that he was killed by being sedated to death at Burnaby Hospital. So by way of background for people that don't know, I'm 68. I had a 2-year-old younger brother. I'm the 8th of 9 children. He was the 9th of 9 children. And he was born with Down syndrome. And in 1958, the same year as Terry Fox, which I used to always point out to him. And at that time, children, it was the fad to institutionalize handicapped children. And there was a huge institution in Ontario called Smith Falls, and the doctors at Toronto Sick Kids recommended, basically they insisted to my parents that Paul be placed in this large institution. We now know, I was trained as a psychologist, and we now know that institutionalization resulted in the death of many children, being separated, the break of attachment bonds, and the lack of emotional bonding kills people, and it killed many of those children. My father said to the doctors, basically, go to hell. I'm bringing my son home with me. And Paul wasn't ready to go home right away, so he stayed in the hospital. As soon as he was ready to go home, my dad brought him home on the train by himself. I think my mother had misgivings about caring for Paul. She didn't know what Down syndrome was. And I think she took it as a personal failing on her part, that she had made, all these healthy babies, and then she made a baby that was not healthy. But she pulled herself together, and she created daycare or preschool for profoundly disabled children like Paul. She took over my bedroom, the biggest bedroom in our house, and turned it into a preschool for neighborhood handicapped kids. The Ontario government had absolutely no education for handicapped children. If you were handicapped, you didn't get an education in the 1950s and 60s. And so we always had a daycare. I just thought that was what everybody did. So Paul and I grew up together. When he was in his teens, my mother put him in a group home. We lived in Montreal at that time. She put him in a group home for handicapped teenagers, handicapped young people. But he stayed with her on the weekends, and he lived with her on the weekends until she died in 2004. And then he lived with I had 2 sisters here in British Columbia. He lived with us on the weekends and holidays. In 1993, my mother moved out here, basically to help me. I was a single parent, to help me with my children. She brought Paul and she placed him in a group home called L'Arche, L'Arche. L'Arche, we now know, was started as an SEX cult for 2 elderly men, a retired naval officer named John Gean Vanier, Vanier, who, he was a retired Canadian naval officer, and his sidekick, a defrocked, excommunicated Catholic priest from France named Thomas Philippe. So they basically had a front for their cult, and that was to provide residential care for incapable adults like Paul. And this went on for about 50 years, 50 years, until Jean Vanier died in 2019, and it was discovered that all the women that he had preyed upon came out of the closet and told their stories. L'Arche was allowed to investigate itself, and they wrote a 1,000-page investigation, which was published on January 23rd of 2023. They were never investigated by the police. But if the origin story for a group home is that it was started as an sex cult, you know it can't end well, and it did not in our case. My mother would never have placed Paul there for a minute if she knew the backstory of L'Arche. So Paul and I visited at will for 30 years, and I took him to Newfoundland twice. I took him to Seattle. As I said, after my mother died in 2004, he lived with me on weekends and holidays. He was with me about 1 or 2 weekends a month and on holidays. And then I was injured and disabled in an accident in 2008, but I continued to care for Paul at my home until I lost my house in foreclosure. And I had a heart attack, and I had my own health problems. And I was out of touch with Paul. I thought he had died and that they hadn't told me because they didn't contact me after I recovered from the heart attack. I assumed that he had died. When I was able to retire in 2021, in January 2021, I reached out to L'Arche and I asked to resume visits with Paul. And I found out in 2022 that L'Arche had created a secret power of attorney over Paul. They drafted the document. There was no lawyer involved. There was not even a notary. They had their 2 low-level employees witness Paul's signature. So Paul, it was a fraudulent document. It's called a representation agreement because Paul had diminished capacity. He never functioned above the level of a 15-month-old. I taught him the only word that he could ever read or print, and that was his first name, Paul. It took me many months as a little girl teaching him to print the letter P, and then A, and then U, and then L. Somehow I knew how to do that. And it's one of the achievements in my life that I'm most proud of. Anyways, so I discovered after Paula and I had resumed our visits and we were visiting, we had a schedule of visiting twice a week, once on Thursdays at L'Arche and then on Saturdays for 5 hours at my home. I found out in January of 2022 that they had created the secret document, and when I objected to it, they terminated my visits with Paul. They created the document to administer the COVID-19 shot, and they reached out to, Paul had 5 siblings alive at that time, but they reached out to my 81-year-old nun's sister, 4,000 kilometers away in Ontario, who lived in a convent and has never lived with Paul, didn't understand his speech or communication. They wanted to avoid the involvement of my sister here in BC, who had been caring for Paul all along, but who's COVID-19 skeptic. So when I found out about the secret representation, I applied to the court to set it aside. I wasn't successful, but in August of 2022, I went to the RCMP and complained about the document. And what I believe happened, what I understand happened, is that once L'Arche found out that I had complained to the police about the document, they permanently terminated Paul's contact with me, except for a 10-minute telephone call once a week. These people are profoundly evil. They're the kind of people that you only get to know if you're around a vulnerable person. They're the kind of people that are in the business of taking advantage of vulnerable people. So for 588 days, Paul and I were not allowed to visit in person, and I would go to the government office, the BC New Democratic Party government office, and drop off a letter every single day every single business day a polite letter asking to meet with them so that I could restore Paul's visits with me. In our telephone calls, he begged me to visit him. He asked me to take him to a movie. He cried. He would tell me he loved me over and over again. It is like torture. So I thought he had died, and when I found out he hadn't died, and we had resumed visits, it felt like a miracle. But then Larsh's lawyer, Tara Britnell, terminated our visits, and it felt like torture. But every day I went to the BC New Democratic Party government office, and I just asked to meet with somebody there to try and give my side of the story. They never met with me once. They never exchanged one word with me. And in 588 days, they allowed one one-hour visit on December 23rd of 2023. And that was the last time I saw Paul before he had a stroke on April 13th of 2024. And I copied the letter to David Eby, the premier. The leader of the BC New Democratic Party is a guy named David Eby, who used to be the president of the BC, British Columbia Civil Liberties Association. And as I've said before, you never seen a human being less interested in civil liberties. And I copied these letters to every single person, to Sheila Malcolmson, who was the head of the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction that paid Paul's bills. They never met with me. They never responded. I got one letter from their lawyer saying, we're not going to respond to you anymore, and they never did. They never did. The New Democratic Party is a socialist, thinly veiled communist socialist, evil group of people. And I'm ashamed to say, I was, for much of my life, I was a New Democratic Party supporter. I worked on Sven Robinson. The first new NDP member of parliament was Sven Robinson, and I worked on his first campaign, and I actually worked on his last campaign as well. But through this experience of watching my brother be locked away, confined against his will, with no recourse at all, the BC New Democratic Party wouldn't meet with me, wouldn't talk with me. And they supported the appointment of my 81-year-old nun sister 4,000 kilometers away in Ontario as Paul's substitute decision maker. And she and I do not get along for very good reasons, very valid reasons. And she used my separation from Paul as a means of retaliation for past slights, disagreements that we had. She's a very bad person. A very bad person with a very deep pocket. Her religious community has charitable tax exempt status, so none of the money that she spent on lawyers, and she hired 2 law firms to keep Paul locked away. And she didn't have to pay she could write off all of those legal expenses, whereas every penny that I borrowed to try and pursue Paul's legal entitlements. They were not tax exempt, and I couldn't write them off. So on April 13th, Paul had a stroke. I wasn't informed. They waited to see if he was going to die or not. And when it was clear he wasn't going to die, then the evil nun flew out here. And he had to die because she knew that the police were investigating the fraudulent and forged representation agreement. And Larsh did not want me to get a sample of Paul's signature, and they did not want me or anyone to be able to interview him. So that's the backstory. Paul died on April 21st of 2024. I got a call from the Burnaby RCMP saying they had been directed by Ottawa, their oversight agency, to investigate their investigation into the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. or representation agreement. And I went to court the next morning. I tried to explain to the judge that the government was involved and that there had been a change in circumstance, but there wasn't enough time to get back, to litigate that. And when I got back to Paul's room at Burnaby Hospital, my sister said to me, she didn't look me in the eye. Her jaw was set, and I could see she was pissed. She was really pissed because she knew that the police had been directed to investigate. And she said, say goodbye to Paul. He's dying. And to me, although he had been recovering steadily and miraculously, he grabbed a book from my hand and turned the pages. He looked me in the eye. He squeezed my hand. He was recovering. He had a ventilator on. He had a catheter and was receiving intravenous. When I went back to his room, after my sister learned that the police were investigating, all of those things were gone. He had no ventilator, no catheter, no intravenous, and it looked like he had been killed. And what I believe is she told the treating doctor, and I can tell you this, I've told the coroner and I've told the College of Physicians and Surgeons, she told the treating doctor that he was in pain and to sedate him. And although he was recovering, his health was very fragile and he couldn't handle whatever sedative they gave him or painkiller. So they killed him. The Burnaby Hospital killed my brother. The response to that is a claim for wrongful death, but in British Columbia, a wrongful death claim is only worth $10,000. So there's no lawyer that will take that case. But as far as I know, to the best of my knowledge, the police are still investigating the fraudulent and forged representation agreement, which was the basis for my sister's substitute decision-making power over my brother. The Sisters of St. Joseph of Sault Ste. Marie, that's her community. Now, I estimate she spent $350,000, or she paid lawyers $350,000, but you, the taxpayer, would be subsidizing that because she had tax-exempt status and would have written off all of those legal fees as a charitable expense. It was not a charitable expense. It was a personal expense. So I'm only halfway through my steps for today, my 10,000 steps for today. The exciting, wonderful news that I wanted to remind everybody is that the National Down Syndrome Society of the United States of America has chosen a photo of Paul to project on the Jumbotron in Times Square in New York City in the United States between 6:50 a.m. and 7 a.m. on Saturday, the day after tomorrow. They're going to display Paul's picture on the Jumbotron in Times Square. My little brother, I've never met anybody who's had their picture displayed on the Jumbotron in Times Square. There's going to be, it's going to be on Facebook. It'll be published on Facebook. The photos, they'll be displaying photos all day long. They've chosen 300 out of 3,000 photos that were submitted, and they accepted Paul's photo. So don't forget to check. I'll post the Facebook link so that you just click on the link on Facebook and you can see my brother's photo. So that's the wonderful news. I'm so excited. And I'm trying to change the law in Canada so that to reflect Peter Falk's law in the United States. In the United States, Peter Falk, the Columbo actor, had a stroke in his 70s, and his second wife would not let his adult children visit him. And although they tried legally, they were never able to visit him, just like me. And so the daughter started her inheritance started the Peter Falk Foundation, and changed the law in 22 states so that substitute decision makers like conservators, guardians, and representatives cannot isolate and confine incapable adults from their other loved ones. That's not a right that they have. So I'm trying to get the law changed in Canada adult guardianship laws changed in Canada. In BC, that would be the Patients Property Act. So it would be changed so that it is not a right of a representative or anyone with the power of attorney to isolate and confine an incapable adult. I borrowed $12,500 and I obtained expert reports from 2 senior psychiatrists saying that there was no reason why I should not be able to visit Paul and that it would benefit both him and me. It was really a form of torture for the both of us. And the other thing is, there's an election. This is the most important thing on October 19th. Almost a little over a month away, we're going to have an election in British Columbia. And the New Democratic Party is running. The most important thing is they've been in power for 7 years and they've destroyed this province. They've destroyed it. We've been overrun with fentanyl and but the bottom line in my own personal experience is that they never once met with me to discuss my brother so that I could report his abuse. If the only person that can report abuse of a vulnerable person is their guardian, then no one's ever going to be reporting abuse because it's almost always the guardian that is the one that is engaging in the abuse. So the most important thing is that we have to throw these assholes, pardon my language, and I don't normally speak that way, but the New Democratic Party are socialist, communist assholes. And they've destroyed this province. They've run it into the ground. We have to throw them out. So do whatever you, make sure that you're registered to vote. Make sure all your friends are registered to vote. Encourage them to vote. All of the parties in British Columbia, well, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party have coalesced to fight the New Democratic Party and throw them out. So now there's the BC Conservatives have a shot at winning and restoring British Columbia to its formal level of normalcy. So make sure you're registered to vote. Sign up with the BC Conservative Party. Offer to volunteer with them. You can provide rides to voters. You can man the phone banks. Just do whatever you can to help the BC Conservative Party so that we can throw these assholes out on their ass. I would feel that was some measure of justice for my little brother being locked up for 588 days and dying alone among strangers. So focus on October 19th. We've got to turn this around. It's a matter of life and death for you and your loved ones. Thank you for watching. Paul, I miss you so much. I hope you're having fun in heaven with Mom and Dad and Murray and Teresa and Harry. I miss you so much, dear.